A couple of days ago, I was playing a simul in New York City, and I reached the following endgame with my opponent. So I think you can tell from the position that he was a relatively advanced player, because here we are in a rook endgame where he's not even down material and is only just marginally worse because white's rook is a bit more active, right? And right now this rook is threatening to go to d7 and attack a pawn. So black has a couple of choices here. He can either go with this uninspiring looking move, rook d6. You can call it rather passive. He can also try to go for counterplay with f4, or just offer up a rook trade, which is the safe option, at least in terms of not letting the d5 pawn get attacked. So my opponent actually decided this was the way to go, rook e7. And not only he made that decision, but he actually expressed his thoughts out loud that he was pretty sure that this king and pawn endgame was going to be safe for him, that there's just no way he could be losing this. So I heard him out and I was like, well, I can see why you think so, but there's also a few things that I know about king and pawn endgames that make me think that white could have chances to win this one. So let's take a closer look. I wound up trading the rooks because I don't really have much of a choice. Otherwise, my rook just has to give up its good position. And here we are. So my opponent has one side of the board that he needs to defend, which is the king side and the e5 square. The queen side is completely locked up. White's king can't get in there, so there's nothing to worry about. His king is close to the position that he needs to be next to. So that's where his confidence is coming from, that his king can just defend everything. But there's a few things that black underestimated here, which is the availability of reserve tempos for white. So what are reserve tempos? These are pawn moves that white can use to pass the turn to black and make him move his king out of the desired position. And white has a whole 3 reserve tempos here, which is actually a lot for a king and pawn endgame. I mean, sometimes just one tempo is enough to win the game. And here white has 3 to work with, and they're actually going to be useful. So the first thing is that white needs to improve the king. So we're heading towards the infiltration squares. Black has to guard these 2 squares. So right now he's keeping out the white king. And this is where the reserve tempos start coming in handy. So let's say we go b3. Black has to move the king, and he's got to make sure that my king doesn't get into e5. So king e6 is the only option. We make our first move onto their side of the board. They go back to defend the pawn, and we go here. And now they have 2 choices, king like this, or if they are really desperate, they might start looking at the pawn sacrifice. But let's first examine king f6. They're taking opposition again. Again, our king cannot make progress on his own. But we're going to use our second reserve tempo like this. So passing the turn to black, taking opposition, and doing this thing where our king comes from the back. So this is probably the idea that my opponent missed, this idea of coming from the back. It's actually a really famous one for this kind of situation. So this is definitely not like a unique king and pawn endgame theme. Like, it was definitely something that I had come across many times. And now the result is that black will just have to move his king and lose that pawn. Black is in zugzwang. So black might feel desperate about his situation after king h6. He might try f4 just so his king won't be trapped. But unfortunately, losing the pawn is a problem because white is still going to be able to use the zugzwang ideas to win the endgame. I mean, black has to move the king now. You might think he's happy to take the pawn, but it also means he loses that pawn and the next one, and he's just behind in the race to take white's pawns. So let's go back for a second and see what we can learn. The first thing is that this is absolutely a huge decision, right? Every single transition into a king and pawn endgame, especially ones where you have certain disadvantages like a more passive king or some weak squares that you're going to need to protect, or a lack of reserve tempos is something you need to be very careful about. And so it's funny, and ironic how, the move that seemed safe was actually completely losing, right? You think you're challenging the strong white rook. What you're really doing is going into a king and pawn endgame that you're not going to be able to save no matter how well you play. So what are we using to win this king and pawn endgame? We're using better king position, the availability of infiltration squares, weak squares in the opponent's position that our king wants to get to, and something that we call reserve tempos, which were really the key, and we had a ton of them to work with. So what should black have done instead? Well, the active move f4 is actually, unfortunately, not working. I mean, the idea is sort of nice because you want to break up white's pawns and get your king into the game, right? But we just ignore it like that. And unfortunately, we do wind up winning that pawn. And so I guess black is not getting enough counterplay here. And that whittles it down to the move rook d6. Yes, it's definitely passive looking. Yeah, not really the first thing you want to think about, actually. And given that we recently did a lesson on endgames where I said rook activity is such a key principle, it really should feel unnatural to you guys to play that move. It is a passive move that kind of goes against that principle. But really what black is doing is saying, well, you can't break through. Yes, rook d6 is passive, but where is your breakthrough? Like, I'm holding all my weak pawns, right? So white just is limited in their entries into black's position here. And of course, the rook can sort of shuttle between these squares. And there's also, there actually are ideas of playing g5 in the position that we can use. So for example, if white goes with like a pawn move like f4, then you can just move your king like that, because white just has no entries with this king. If white goes with a pawn move like f3, well, we don't want to do that because actually this king is going to be coming in, but black would have to go for this. And this seems to hold, right? So it's not like trivial. Black definitely has to play some careful moves here. Like, basically, this rook is in zugzwang, this king is in zugzwang, and black is kind of lucky that he still has a pawn move to kind of keep the game going. And on rook h7, he can guard that pawn with king g6. And basically, black is holding on in this endgame despite the more passive rook. But of course, as the endgame plays out, black will always be looking for ways to make that rook more active. And, we'll always be looking at like the open files, depending on which one opens up to activate the rook. But if he won't be able to, then perhaps he can just use the fact that white won't be able to break through anywhere. So yes, a bit paradoxical, guys, because rook d6 is not a move that you make without a bit of a heavy heart, right? And definitely having exhausted your more active options. But given the issues in the position with rook d7 and possibly like a rook c6 check in case you move your rook, black will have to narrow it down to rook d6. So the lesson, guys, is that you have to be super careful about entering king and pawn endgames. It's not just everything sort of looks okay on the surface, so I can do it. Like, if I'm not down any pawns, it should go way deeper than that. The factoring in that you're doing, right? So make sure you're taking a good look at whose king is going to be more active. Obviously, things like whether there's passed pawns or the ability to create passed pawns, which wasn't really a factor in this endgame, but in other ones it can be. And the idea of reserve tempos to put the opponent into zugzwang.